Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You'll never believe the audacity of my sister, and honestly, if I weren't standing there when it happened, I wouldn't believe it myself. Imagine this. Your wedding day is just weeks away. The dress of your dreams is finally in your hands, and for the first time, everything feels real. You run your fingers over the delicate lace, picturing yourself walking down the aisle, the train flowing behind you like a dream. And then, boom, your sister waltzes in, throws it on without asking, and announces that she looks better in it anyway. And the worst part? My mother nods in agreement, barely sparing me a glance before dismissing my feelings entirely. Let me introduce myself before I get ahead of things. My name is Emily, and for as long as I can remember, my younger sister Sophie has always been the golden child. It didn't matter what she did, whether she stole my toys as a kid, took credit for my hard work in school, or even flirted with my boyfriends just to see if she could. Our mother always found a way to justify it. "She's just being playful," she would say, "or you need to stop being so sensitive, and my personal favorite, she's your sister. You should be happy for her." Happy for her? When she spent her entire life treating me like an afterthought. Yeah, right. So, of course, when she walked into my apartment, found my wedding dress hanging in the protective garment bag, and decided to try it on for just a minute, I should have seen what was coming. But stupidly, I didn't. I thought, maybe just this once, she would respect something that belonged to me. Maybe she would twirl in front of the mirror, giggle, and take it off before anything happened. But no, not Sophie. She spun around, admiring herself, pulling out her phone to snap a few selfies before finally turning to me with a smirk that made my stomach drop. "You know," she said, smoothing her hands over the bodice, "I actually look really good in this." I forced a smile, waiting for the inevitable joke, the part where she'd laugh and hand it back, but her eyes glimmered with something else entirely. Then she said it. The words that made my blood run cold. "I think I'm gonna keep it." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I had misheard her, that maybe this was just another one of her sick little games. But then my mother, who had been sitting on the couch, watching this unfold like it was some kind of soap opera, shrugged and said, "She does look better in it, Emily. Maybe you should let her have it." I stood there, gripping the back of a chair so tightly my knuckles turned white, struggling to process what had just happened. My own mother, the woman who was supposed to support me, had just taken my sister's side, again. And Sophie, sensing my hesitation, took it a step further. "Yeah, I mean, you can just get another one, right? It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. My wedding dress. The one I had spent months searching for, the one that fit like it was made for me, the one I had imagined myself walking down the aisle in since the moment I tried it on. I could have screamed. I could have fought. I could have ripped the dress off her body and told her exactly what I thought of her entitlement. But instead, I did something that shocked even myself. I smiled. I let her bask in her little victory, let her turn around in front of the mirror one last time, let her believe, just for a moment, that she had won. And then, just as she grabbed her purse and flounced toward the door, I said, "Good thing that's not the real one." The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie froze mid-step, her fingers tightening around the doorknob. My mother straightened on the couch, her face twisting in confusion. "What?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp, her previous confidence wavering. I walked to the closet, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached for the hidden box on the top shelf. My fingers curled around the edge, and as I pulled it down, I turned just in time to see their expressions shift, from arrogance to disbelief, from triumph to something else entirely. Their eyes followed my movements, darting from the box to the dress Sophie was still wearing and then back to me. And that's when I knew. This wasn't over yet. Sophie's face twisted in confusion as she stared at me, her fingers still clenching the doorknob as if she wasn't sure whether to walk away victorious or demand an explanation about the dress she had just claimed as her own. My mother, who had been so quick to defend Sophie's ridiculous entitlement, suddenly sat up straighter on the couch, her lips pursed in that disapproving way she always had when she realized something wasn't quite going in Sophie's favor. The smugness that had radiated from them both only moments earlier began to crack at the edges, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of explaining anything, not yet at least. Instead, I simply smirked, ran my fingers along the edge of the secret box I had just retrieved, and watched as unease began to creep into Sophie's expression. The truth was, I had always known this moment would come in one form or another, because I had spent my entire life watching Sophie take whatever she wanted without consequence. She had done it with my clothes, my friends, my childhood diaries, and even my ex-boyfriend at one point, though she swore up and down that nothing had actually happened. So when I finally found my dream wedding dress, a piece of me already knew that if I left it out in the open, Sophie would find a way to make it about her. And because I knew her so well, because I understood the twisted way her mind worked, I had planned for this exact scenario well in advance. 3 months ago, long before Sophie even knew what my wedding dress looked like, I went back to the boutique where I had originally found it and asked if they had anything similar, something close enough that it could pass as the real thing at a glance, but with just enough wrong that I would never actually wear it down the aisle. The consultant had looked at me strangely at first, but when I explained, she let out a laugh and told me she had just the thing. It was a discontinued sample dress, the same silhouette as my actual gown, but with a stiff fabric that wrinkled in all the wrong places, a bodice that sat just a little too high, and a skirt that had been slightly yellowed from being on display too long. To the untrained eye, it was beautiful, but to me, it was the perfect decoy. I bought it on the spot, kept it in a different garment bag, and left it exactly where I knew Sophie would find it. So when she walked out of my apartment that day, dress in hand and victory in her eyes, she thought she had won. She thought she had snatched the most important thing from me, that she had stolen a piece of my happiness in the way she always did. But what she didn't realize, what she would soon find out, was that I had just played her at her own game, and this time, I was 3 steps ahead. It didn't take long for her to start flaunting it. Within hours, her social media was flooded with pictures of her wearing the dress, twirling in front of her bedroom mirror with captions that made my stomach twist with a familiar anger. Feeling like a bride already, who needs a fiancé? One post read, and another, even worse, some dresses are just meant for certain people. Sorry, sis. The comments were full of people fawning over her, telling her how stunning she looked, asking when the wedding was, and worst of all, congratulating her as if she were the one getting married instead of me. I showed the posts to my mother, thinking, hoping, maybe, that this would be the moment she finally saw Sophie for what she was. But my mother simply sighed, took a sip of her tea, and said, "She's just excited. Emily, you've always been so dramatic about these things." That was the moment I decided that being the bigger person wasn't an option anymore. That was the moment I realized that if I wanted to teach Sophie a lesson she would never forget, I couldn't just sit back and let this slide. So I started planning. It wasn't going to be loud, and it wasn't going to be messy, because Sophie thrived on drama and attention, and if I fought her head-on, she would twist the narrative until she came out looking like the victim. No, I needed this to be subtle, quiet, something that would unravel her piece by piece until she had no choice but to admit defeat. Which is why, after taking a deep breath and steadying my nerves, I picked up my phone and dialed the bridal boutique. The consultant answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey," I said, forcing a polite smile even though no one could see me. "I need to make some changes to my order." I could almost hear the curiosity in her pause before she responded, of course. "What are you thinking?" I glanced at my laptop screen, where Sophie's latest Instagram post flashed back at me, her in that dress, one hand on her hip, the other holding a bouquet she had no right to touch, her smile wide and triumphant. I tightened my grip on the phone and smiled. "I have a little surprise planned." The morning of my wedding arrived with an eerie calm, the kind that felt unnatural, like the air just before a thunderstorm when the sky holds its breath and everything is still. I stood in front of the mirror in my bridal suite, my reflection staring back at me with steady eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Today was the day that everything would unfold exactly as I had planned, and no amount of Sophie's entitlement or my mother's blind favoritism could change what was about to happen. Downstairs, the venue was already filling with guests, the murmur of voices drifting up through the open window, a mixture of excitement and anticipation. I could picture it all so clearly: the perfectly arranged flower displays, the candlelit aisle, the grand chandelier that sparkled overhead like 1,000 tiny stars. And, of course, Sophie, who I had no doubt was already floating around in her stolen dress, basking in the attention, believing she had successfully stolen my moment along with my gown. I had seen the pictures she posted the night before, the ones where she stood in front of a mirror, the dress cascading around her like she had been born to wear it, her smug smile practically radiating through the screen. The caption had made my blood simmer, though I had kept my expression neutral when I read it. A dress this beautiful deserves to be worn by someone who knows how to own it. It was classic Sophie, always needing to twist the knife just a little deeper, always needing to ensure that I knew my place beneath her. But what she didn't know, what she had been too blinded by her own arrogance to even consider, was that the joke had never been on me. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my thoughts, and a moment later, the door swung open, revealing my maid of honor, Rachel, her face a mix of amusement and barely contained anticipation. "She's here," Rachel said, her voice low with an edge of mischief. "And Emily, I swear to God, she looks like she just won the lottery." I let out a soft chuckle, smoothing the front of my robe as I turned away from the mirror. "Good," I murmured, grabbing my bouquet from the vanity. "Let her have her moment." The ceremony was set to begin in less than an hour, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I could already hear Sophie's laughter floating through the air, high and bright, the kind of laugh she always used when she wanted everyone in the room to look at her. As I descended the stairs, my gaze swept the crowd, and it didn't take long to find her standing near the entrance, surrounded by a small cluster of guests, all of them watching her with expressions that ranged from admiration to mild confusion. She was wearing the dress, of course, the same one she had so gleefully taken from me weeks ago, but now that I was seeing it under the bright venue lights, I almost wanted to laugh. The fabric, which had once looked pristine, now had a slight yellowish tint in certain areas, and the stiff structure of the bodice gave it an oddly rigid appearance, as if it had been designed for someone with an entirely different body shape. The skirt, which had seemed full and elegant when I first bought it, looked oddly wrinkled now, the fabric folding in awkward places, betraying its age as a discontinued sample piece that had once been handled by too many hands. Sophie, oblivious to the subtle but unmistakable imperfections, stood with one hand on her hip, smiling as if she had already claimed victory, her eyes locking onto mine the moment she spotted me across the room. "You're welcome, by the way," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder as I approached. "For keeping it safe. I knew you'd come around." I tilted my head, letting my expression remain neutral, though I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on us, the curiosity thick in the air. "Of course," I replied smoothly, my voice light. "I mean, who else could have done such a great job showing it off?" Rachel, who had been standing slightly behind me, let out a sharp cough, poorly disguising what I knew was a laugh, but Sophie was too wrapped up in herself to notice. The whispers started small, just a few murmurs from the older guests near the back, but as Sophie turned slightly, the noise spread like a ripple in a pond, hushed conversations and sideways glances, guests leaning in to whisper in each other's ears. I watched as Sophie's posture stiffened ever so slightly, her brows drawing together in the faintest hint of uncertainty as she glanced around the room, trying to decipher what had shifted so suddenly in the air. And then it happened. The sunlight streaming in from the grand windows shifted just enough to illuminate her fully, casting her in a bright glow, and that's when the first audible gasp rang through the space, followed almost immediately by a sharp intake of breath from someone near the front. Sophie, still lost in whatever fantasy she had built in her mind, took a step toward the ceremony doors, oblivious to the way people were staring, their eyes widening in something that looked far too much like horror. She paused then, hesitating for the first time, her hands gripping the fabric at her sides as if some subconscious part of her was sensing that something was terribly, terribly wrong. I watched as she turned slightly, her eyes darting downward, and then, finally, realization dawned. The expression that crossed her face in that moment was something I would remember for the rest of my life. For a brief moment, Sophie stood frozen in place, her entire body rigid as the whispers in the crowd turned into something more, a wave of gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and scattered laughter that bubbled up from the back of the room like a fire catching on dry grass. She still hadn't fully grasped what was happening, still hadn't realized the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her, but I could see the exact second it hit. Her gaze dropped downward, her fingers tightening around the edges of the fabric, and then her eyes widened in absolute horror as she saw what everyone else had already noticed. The dress, the one she had so proudly stolen, the one she had paraded all over town in, the one she had claimed looked better on her than it ever could on me, had turned sheer under the bright, unforgiving sunlight that poured in through the grand windows of the venue. The once innocent white fabric, which had seemed perfectly opaque in dim lighting, was now revealing far too much, leaving little to the imagination as the delicate lace and thin layers failed to conceal what they were meant to hide. Sophie let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, her hands frantically flying to cover herself as realization set in, but it was too late, far too late for anything but complete and utter humiliation. The guests, many of whom had already been watching her with barely disguised amusement, were no longer even trying to hide their reactions. Laughter, sharp and unrestrained, rang through the air, mixing with the mortified murmurs of those who didn't know whether to look away or continue witnessing the absolute train wreck unfolding before them. I stood perfectly still, my expression calm, my hands resting lightly on my bouquet as I watched her crumble in real time. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had planned for, and yet there was no rush of gloating satisfaction, no overwhelming wave of triumph, just a quiet, steady certainty that Sophie had finally faced the consequences of her own selfishness. She turned to our mother then, her face contorted with shock and betrayal, as if this entire disaster had somehow been anyone's fault but her own. "Mom," she gasped, her voice cracking as she took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the sheer folds of the ruined dress. "Do something." Our mother, who up until that moment had been sitting with her usual air of smugness, now looked as if she had swallowed something bitter and rotten. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands tightening around the edge of her chair, and for the first time in what felt like my entire life, I saw something close to actual embarrassment flicker across her face. She had spent years defending Sophie, making excuses for her behavior, brushing aside every selfish thing she had ever done, but now she was faced with undeniable proof that her golden child had pushed things too far. Still, she tried. Of course, she tried. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor, her voice sharp with anger as she turned to me instead of the daughter who had actually caused the disaster. "Emily," she snapped, her tone low and dangerous, "what did you do?" I let the silence stretch between us for a moment, let her words hang in the air as the last remnants of Sophie's dignity crumbled beneath the weight of 100 staring eyes. Then, slowly, deliberately, I lifted one shoulder in a half-shrug, my voice smooth and devoid of any real emotion. "You always said she looked better in it," I said simply, tilting my head as if I were genuinely considering the situation. "I guess you were right." The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos with a quiet finality that left my mother momentarily speechless. Sophie, now beyond the point of coherent words, let out a frustrated scream, her hands still gripping the fabric as if she could somehow fix the irreversible damage, and then, without another word, she turned on her heel and ran. It was a spectacle unlike anything I had ever seen before. Sophie, the sister who had spent her entire life making sure the spotlight was always on her, was now fleeing the venue with tears streaming down her face, her ruined dress dragging behind her as guests openly laughed, some even reaching for their phones. no doubt eager to document the downfall of the girl who had spent years acting as if she were untouchable. She didn't stop at the doors, didn't even glance back as she threw them open and disappeared into the bright afternoon sun, her departure leaving behind a stunned, electrified silence that stretched through the room. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting for this exact moment, the pastor cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "Well," he said, adjusting his glasses as he turned to me with an expectant expression. "Shall we proceed with the ceremony?" The laughter quieted, the murmurs died down, and for the first time since Sophie had made her disastrous exit, every set of eyes in the room was suddenly on me. I opened my mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Because for the first time since this entire mess had started, I found myself hesitating. For the first time in weeks, as I stood in the center of the room with every single guest staring at me, waiting for me to give some kind of answer, I found myself hesitating in a way that I hadn't expected. The pastor's words hung in the air between us, heavy with expectation, but instead of nodding and allowing the ceremony to continue, instead of letting the day unfold the way it was always meant to, I found myself questioning everything that had led me to this exact moment. Why did I hesitate? Why, after all of this, after months of planning, after the perfect revenge, after watching Sophie humiliate herself in front of everyone, did I feel something nagging at the edges of my mind, something I couldn't quite ignore? And then, as I stood there in my wedding dress, surrounded by people who had come to witness what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the answer hit me with an almost painful clarity. Because this day was never really about me. This entire day, from the moment Sophie had stolen my dress, from the moment my mother had taken her side yet again, had stopped being about love, about my future, about celebrating something meaningful. It had become about proving a point. It had become about making sure Sophie paid for what she had done, about showing my mother that she couldn't always sweep Sophie's behavior under the rug, about finally standing up for myself in a way that left no room for argument. And now that it was done, now that Sophie had run from the church in disgrace, now that my mother sat in stunned silence with her carefully constructed world crumbling around her, I realized something else that made my stomach twist. I didn't want this wedding anymore. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep over the guests, watching as their expressions shifted from anticipation to confusion as I took a step back from the altar instead of forward. My fiancé, Daniel, was standing beside me, his brow furrowed as he reached for my hand, his fingers gentle against mine as if he could sense what was coming before I even said the words out loud. "Emily?" His voice was quiet, just for me, his concern evident in the way he squeezed my hand. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a lifetime of expectations pressing down on me, the years of always trying to keep the peace, always trying to be the reasonable one, always letting things slide for the sake of avoiding conflict. And I realized, in that moment, that I was done playing by rules that only seemed to exist to keep me in a place where I was never allowed to truly be happy. "I can't do this," I said, my voice steady even as my heart pounded in my chest. A murmur rippled through the guests, confused whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire, but I ignored them, my focus solely on Daniel. "This day should have been about us," I continued, my voice gaining strength as I spoke, "but it hasn't been for a long time. It's been about drama, about proving something, about dealing with my family's endless toxicity. And I don't want to start the rest of my life like this." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his gaze searching mine, and then, just when I started to worry that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't understand, he let out a slow breath and nodded. "Okay," he said simply, his lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. "Then let's do this our way." A gasp came from the front row, and I didn't even have to look to know it was my mother, her carefully composed mask finally cracking under the weight of what was happening. "Emily," she snapped, her voice sharp and furious, "don't be ridiculous. You are not walking away from your own wedding." I turned to face her then, taking in the stunned expression on her face, the barely contained rage in her eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing but indifference toward whatever judgment she was about to throw my way. This isn't about a dress, I said, my voice calm, my words slow and deliberate as I met her gaze without an ounce of hesitation. It's about respect. And you never gave me any. Something shifted in my mother's face then, something almost imperceptible, but I caught it, the first flicker of realization, the first glimpse of understanding that maybe, just maybe, she had finally pushed me too far. But it was too late now. I wasn't standing here waiting for her approval anymore. Sophie, still red-faced and humiliated, had made her way back into the room at some point, her dress still a crumpled disaster around her, her eyes wet with unshed tears as she stepped forward, her voice breaking as she tried to regain some semblance of control. "Emily," she started, her tone softer than I had ever heard it, like she actually thought an apology would fix everything. But I shook my head before she could even finish. "You don't get to do this," I said, cutting her off before she could turn this into something it wasn't. "You don't get to take whatever you want, humiliate people, treat them like nothing, and then expect everything to be fine the moment you decide it should be." Her mouth opened, then closed, and for the first time in her life, Sophie looked well and truly speechless. I turned away from her before she could try again, my hands still firmly in Daniel's as I met his gaze, my heart lighter than it had felt in years. "Let's go," I said simply. And just like that, we walked away. We left the venue, left the guests whispering, left my mother still reeling from the reality of what had just happened, left Sophie standing in the wreckage of her own making. And by the time the sun had set, by the time the chaos of the day had fully settled, Daniel and I were already on our way to a quiet little chapel miles away, far from the noise, far from the expectations, far from everything that had tried to turn my wedding day into something it was never meant to be. We got married that night, just the two of us, with no audience, no drama, no family interference, and as I stood beside the man I loved, saying my vows with nothing but sincerity in my heart, I finally understood what happiness was supposed to feel like. Turns out, my wedding was never ruined. I just had to do it my way.